Genie Wiley was known as a feral child due to the complex and horrific child abuse that was done to her for 11 years. Genie Wiley never even learned how to speak, eat, swallow, or even behave as a normal child or a person. Genie was kept locked away in a room for 11 years. She stayed like this until her mom made one tiny little mistake. Hi, welcome to the Decomposing Flower podcast. I'm your host, Jen, and with me is Kira. In this podcast, we discuss all sorts of interesting cases that we find disturbing, interesting, or just downright scary. In today's episode, we are going to be discussing the horrific child abuse case of Genie Wiley. If anything we say in any of our episodes is incorrect, ignorant, or just wrong, feel free to let us know. We mean no harm or disrespect to any victims or anyone affected by this case. So with that, let's begin. This is a serious case that talks a lot about child abuse, child neglect. There's a lot of ableism in this. And so I'm going to read off all the trigger warnings that I have listed. And if any of these are too much for you, we obviously understand. So, abusive relationships, extreme child abuse, child neglect, abusive behavior, extreme isolation, extreme ableism, inaccurate depiction of autism and mental disabilities, unethical care, mentions of weird family dynamics, mental health issues and disorders, psychosis, mentions of death, brief mention of potential sexual abuse, poor treatment by social services, and shitty foster care system and shitty foster care homes. So obviously, if any of that is too much for you to handle, we understand, and we hope to see you in another video. You can check out our last episode where Kira talked about a really crazy volcano situation that happened. So, Genie Wiley was born in Arcadia, California in 1957. Some sources said her birthday was in April, but a lot of her information is very classified. They've kept a lot of her privacy, so I don't really know if that was her birthday because some places said it wasn't, and her name actually isn't Genie. We don't really know her true name. I think they just wanted to keep her definitely private. Her researchers that she had later in her life actually gave her the name Genie, and I'll also talk a lot more about that later because I don't want to jump too far ahead. So obviously, Genie Wiley had undergone, like I said, extreme child abuse done to her by her own father. And I think we kind of need to talk a little bit about her parents because obviously it kind of will give more insight of who they were and what they were like. So Jeannie was the fourth child to Clark and Dorothy Wiley. Although she only had one older brother, the two siblings had actually died previously, but her dad was like this. I guess the best words to describe him is just fucking evil. I really can't think of any other words. He was a flight mechanic in World War II, and I'm sure that probably caused him a lot of trauma, like most did. But he had a really weird childhood. His mom had given him a female name. Don't know what the name was. I couldn't find it. But this apparently made him hate his mom to the point he just despised her. His dad actually was killed by a lightning bolt. That's something. So they say he might have been in orphanages, but I don't really know. His mom though ran a brothel. And I don't know if she ran a brothel as in she was the head of it, or if she was also doing sex work, or if she was forced into it because Clark's dad died. Who knows? Clark and his mom eventually did develop a closer relationship when he became an adult. When he became an adult, he changed his name to Clark because he said, but once he got closer with his mom, they developed this really close relationship. She was spending every single day she could with him. And their relationship was just definitely weird, which I'll get more into as I talk. But I couldn't really find a whole lot on how Clark met Dorothy. The only thing I do know is that Clark was 20 years older than her. And actually, by the time Jeannie was born, he was close to 50 years old or 60 years old. So there was a big father daughter age gap. He was a pretty old dad. But I mean, maybe this was kind of common back then. I'm not too sure. But Dorothy, she had her own like a little bit of issues. She had a head injury and there was like her it caused a lot of neurological issues which caused her to go blind in one eye, or like she was losing her vision in her one eye.
Mm.
And with that, Clark and her had a very abusive relationship. He would like beat her, strangle her, really terrible things to her. He would isolate her. He wouldn't let her leave the home. And again, she was like 20 years younger, and I couldn't really find a whole lot on her like history. Like I don't know a whole lot about like where her parents were. I don't know how old she was when she started dating him. Their relationship was so abusive and to the point where he beat her so bad that her retina detached and she did become
Holy
blind.
shit.
Yeah. She became blind in one eye, and that made her very dependent on him. And I think he wanted that, obviously, like most abusers do. They never wanted kids though. Clark said that he hated kids, they were too loud. And I can understand if you're like a victim, or I guess like you were in the war, like noises can be very triggering. But I guess that didn't stop them from having kids. And they actually had a baby. And what happened during this was like really insane because Clark beat Dorothy during her pregnancy. And when she was like severely, pretty heavily pregnant, he beat her so bad she went into the hospital and she gave birth. And I don't know if she gave birth because of the beating or if it was like just a coincidence of timing. I don't know. But they let her go home with the baby to Clark. And I just think like that just really shows you like the
Wow.
time, because I feel like that was just common back then where like women just couldn't really get out of abusive relationships. And like this was probably like the late 40s. And so I guess that was just like they just didn't give a fuck. Like, I don't know. I just think that's pretty fucked up. But one day, about 10 weeks, when the baby was like around 10 weeks old, the baby like was crying like babies do, and Clark got fed up with the baby and he put the baby in the garage, and the baby died overnight from like hypothermia. And
No way.
they ended up having a second child, and this was a boy. He died 2 days later. He actually had RH incompatibility. Now listen, I'm not a doctor. I did look it up. RH is like a blood group system that has like proteins on its surfaces. I don't know a whole lot about it, but if both parents have like a negative like blood type or something, I don't know. Okay, listen, I'm not a doctor. But if both parents are negative, the baby can have an RH incompatibility, and this caused like a lot of issues. And I'm only mentioning this because both Jeannie and her brother also had this. But this baby died 2 days later from these issues. And then 3 years later, Jeannie's brother John was born. And John actually was pretty healthy, although he did have RH incompatibility. But they said he was pretty healthy. But obviously the abuse didn't just stop or just stay with Dorothy. He was also abusive to John. When John was like first like born and all this, he would tell Dorothy like to not communicate with John. And as most people know, like you can't not talk to your baby because that fucks them up. Like I'm pretty sure like newborns, if you even don't touch them, they can die. I'm not too sure. I think I read that somewhere, but he just really didn't communicate. Like I think he just really didn't like noise or whatever, which we'll like learn about more. He was like to Dorothy, don't talk to John or just be very quiet. And this obviously like really stunted John, and he had a lot of issues with his physical development and his like speaking. And so Clark's mom, she actually noticed this. And so she took John for like several months to help him like develop properly. And
Wow.
so by her doing that, it did help John, and John was able to talk and, I guess live a normal life. And I'm using normal very loosely because obviously what he experienced later is still not normal, but he was able to do what normal kids can kind of do, I guess. So 5 years later, in like 1957, Jeannie was born, and Jeannie was born from, she was a C-section baby, and she was really healthy actually. And then a few days later, she actually did have like symptoms of the RH incompatibility, and so she needed like a blood transfusion. But other than that, she was pretty normal. She actually did have this like hip dislocation issue though, where she had to wear a splint from 4.5 months to 11 months.
Mhm.
And because of this, John believed that she was mentally delayed, and he just pretty much thought, like, because of that, that there was no point in talking to her and engaging with her. And so he would tell, like, John and Dorothy to not really talk to her, let her play by herself. They would, like, feed her kind of, like, whenever she, like, needed it, I guess. But he was pretty much just like, she's mentally delayed. So he just didn't believe he needed to talk to her, I guess. And obviously, this would have already fucked her up. This was just kind of like the beginning of all that. Jeannie's mom though said like she was kind of like a quiet baby. I don't know, they're just like dumb parents. Like, I mean, I know Dorothy was also being abused by Clark, so it's a little hard, but there was just like a lot of issues. When Jeannie was like 11 months old though, she was considered malnourished and she had an extremely high fever, and so they did take her to the doctor, and the doctor was just he just declared that she was mentally disabled. Because of that, Clark was like, I knew it. And so he was pretty much just like, I don't care about her anymore. And just proceeded to not engage with her. And issues with her began though when she was around 20 months old. So when Jeannie was 20 months old, Clark's mother and John were out walking, and Clark's mom was actually hit by a drunk driver and she died.
No
And
way. Oh my god.
yeah, and this was like really like sad, obviously, but he blamed John, and John would have been like a 7-year-old kid. This would have been really traumatizing for him because it was also a hit and run. One of the things was like the driver just got probation or whatever, and so I think this made like Clark like very angry, and he obviously went into this like he was grieving. They said his grief was like very abnormal. He started to become very angry, which I mean he already was, but he was becoming delusional to the point where he just quit his job and he just packed up the four of them and they moved into where his mom was living, which was like a 2-bedroom house. He didn't let them touch any of her car or her room because he wanted to keep it as a shrine to his mom, and he just secluded them all in. He would never let them leave this home. The only way he ever let John leave was if John was going to school. And he was like very weird to John. Like when John would come back home from school, he had to do like a series of tasks to prove that who he was. So they kind of were like assuming that Clark just like went into like this psychosis after his mom died, which makes a lot of sense. But I mean, he was already fucked up, dude, before this. There was a second bedroom upstairs, and that's where he kept Jeannie locked in. And he claimed it was for her protection. He had put her in this like tiny bedroom, and in this bedroom there was just a potty chair, there was a crib, there was a couple pieces of furniture, there was a tiny little window, that there was two raincoats. So she didn't have any like stimuli when she was in there. Now at first he would kind of let Jeannie roam around outside like in her playpen, but because she's like 2 years old basically, she does what 2-year-olds do and they're curious about the world. They touch things, and he got mad at her for basically just being a baby and was like, you know what, I'm gonna lock her in the room. So he made Dorothy make this straight jacket chair thing on like a high chair, and he actually put Jeannie on here and he would tie her down. Her arms were like strapped down to the sides of the potty chair, her legs were strapped, and so she was strapped like that for 13 hours. And then when she would go to bed, he would like tie her down into a sleeping bag, and then he'd put a metal sheet arm so she couldn't move her arms. And so this obviously really fucked up her physical health too. Now, he did not let anyone interact with her. He did not let the brother, he did not let Dorothy, he wouldn't even interact with her. And her only interaction was when they would come and feed her. And when I say feed her, I mean they would just shove food down her mouth. And if she choked, she choked. He didn't really care. He would only feed her soft food. So she never even learned how to like eat like normal, like how to chew and swallow. And there was just like a lot of like if she threw it up, he would just shove it back in her mouth.
Oh my
Sometimes he made
god.
John do this, which would have been really traumatizing as well. And then the other human interaction would have been him physically abusing her. Jeannie spoke, cried, made any noise, Clark would just beat her with a wooden pink plank that they had. And he would do this all the time. But the other thing he did, which I thought was really fucking like fucked up and scary, was he would growl and bare his teeth at her like a dog.
A
And
what?
yeah, right? And he also grew out his fucking nails so that they could scratch
Oh,
her. And
God.
on top of that, if he was like outside the room and he thought she was making a noise, he would growl and scratch at the door like he was a dog. And obviously, this terrified her. She became afraid of dogs and cats later on in life because, I mean, who wouldn't? Like, she had never seen them before. That would have been really scary. I mean, that would be scary even if knew what a dog was. Like, that would just still, that scares me. Like, and because of like the physical abuse, like, she learned to become like very quiet, silent. She never spoke. She didn't cry. And she also became very like catatonic. Like she didn't make any facial like gestures or reactions. Like she just became like nothing. Like she was just catatonic. You can't really not interact with a child. This is going to fuck them up. And like I said, she, because they never spoke to her, she never learned how to speak. She never gained a first language, and that like really like messed with her. And then the other thing was she didn't get any toys to play with. So the toys that he gave her were like plastic containers, like a yogurt container or something, or like a cutout thing of a magazine. But like she obviously couldn't really play because like she was locked down. It wasn't like she was just locked in a room. And they also said like maybe the only other like stimuli that she would have ever received is if she heard birds outside or if she heard like a piano playing from like the neighbors. But other than that, that's what her everyday life was like for 11 years. He was still abusing Dorothy and John, and he was isolating them. He told them that if they ever were to tell like anyone else what was happening, he would kill them. And at this point, Dorothy was becoming way more blind, so she didn't really have like the ability to just leave. And I'm sure
Mm.
John, like, since he grew up like this, he probably didn't know how to tell anyone. And also, like, this is like the 50s, 60s, right? So, like, it's just not like it is now where you could tell someone and people would believe you. A lot of times people just didn't believe victims. But he would hold a gun and, like, sit in the living room and he wouldn't let them, like, watch TV, listen to the radio. They weren't even allowed to really speak. They had to be away from him if they were gonna speak. It was just like really fucking weird shit. Clark believed that when Jeannie would be 12, that she probably would die. And he told Dorothy that if she didn't die by the time she's 12, that she could get social assistance for her. And obviously, Jeannie's birthday came and went, and nothing really happened. And so Dorothy had been basically threatening Clark that she was going to leave if he wasn't going to let her speak to her parents. And he eventually agreed that she could talk to her parents. One day, when Clark was out shopping or doing whatever he did, Dorothy had went and got Jeannie and left the home, just completely left. At this point, John was already moved out. He had been living with friends. So on November 4th of 1970, Dorothy was heading over to a government building because she needed to go get some benefits for her blindness. And she made a huge mistake, but honestly, probably a miracle in disguise. Because of her blindness, she ended up walking into the wrong door. She was actually supposed to go to the door over, but the door she walked into was the general social services door. And they noticed Jeannie, and Jeannie, like I said, like we all know, she was isolated. So she was behaving very, very weird, and she was very small. Like she was like 4'6". She was like 54 pounds, and they were like, she's like really like she's acting weird. And they actually thought that she was like extremely autistic because of how she was behaving. And I mean, I guess like they didn't have like a whole lot of information on autism. I don't know like the history of autism and like all that stuff, but obviously back then they were more about like the physical attributes. And
Mhm.
just like something's going on. And so they were like, this 6-year-old is acting really weird. That's when Dorothy was like, oh, she's not 6, she's 13. And so the other social workers were like, wait, what? Like, she looks 6. I also forgot to mention as well is that Jeannie was walking very weird because she was, like strapped down to a chair for so long. She was walking like her arms were kind of in front of her, like almost like a bunny in a way.
Oh.
And her legs were kind of bent, like she was kind of walking almost like in a seat, like sitting position in a way. They noticed that and they're like, this is really weird. So once they found out she was like 13 and all this stuff and like she can't speak, she would spit a lot, like she had a lot of saliva. So like they really thought like there was just something like really wrong with her and they were like, maybe we need to get her help. But then when they started questioning Dorothy, they were like, this is really weird. Like so they ended up calling the police, obviously, thankfully.
Yeah, thank goodness.
And when they called the police, like the police ended up taking her to the children's hospital in LA, and Jeannie's parents were arrested on child abuse and like child neglect and everything. When they were arrested, like her case was really broadcasted, right? And
Yeah.
there was a lot of media coverage. Neighbors were confused. Neighbors were like, I didn't even know they had a child, like a second child. The police said that when they went into her house, they were like really disturbed by the bedroom because her bedroom was like very dark and they were like, I can't believe a child was in this. Like, people were trying to interview Clark, and Clark said that he had social anxiety. Like, okay. And he got like really upset. Like he refused to speak. And so on like
Oh,
November,
that's so sad. Like, oh, I won't speak, but therefore I'm gonna make sure my child won't speak too. That's
right?
freaking
Like it's
ridiculous.
like it's him being like, I have social anxiety, and it's like, okay, well, you like abused your child to the point they can't fucking speak, so like I don't feel bad for you. It's like,
Yeah.
and
Actually makes
so
me so mad.
it makes me mad. This case makes me mad throughout the entire thing. But on November 20th, he decided he didn't want to do this, so he just took his own life and he left two suicide notes. One of the suicide notes said, be a good boy, I love you. And something that was for his son, but his son wasn't like living there anymore. So I don't really know. But the other one was, and this is like the famous one that some people know if they know about the case, and it was, the world will never understand. Which is like, yeah, no shit. We're never gonna understand why you locked your child away for like 11 years. No
How
shit.
terrifying would that be? Like you have this guy who comes in and beats you and forces vomit down your throat and he scratches at the door and
Right?
growls at you. And so all you know is growling and
Right? And
terror.
like that would be so scary and like you don't know anything and like that like to me like hearing about the dog growling like really scared me actually like cuz it's just like such a lot of people love dogs and then to have that happen to you like it's just like it's just also really creepy that he was like growing out his fucking nails and stuff. And yeah, so after he killed himself and he was supposed to go to court, which obviously he didn't. Dorothy though had an attorney. And then she also had this man named Howard Hansen who was the head of the psychiatry unit at the hospital and he also was an expert on child abuse. Her attorney and this man also like they defended her in court and they were basically like she's severely blind. She's blind in one eye. There was no way she would have ever been able to get out of this situation and defend her children. And so her charges were dropped, and she did proceed to stay in Jeannie's life until Dorothy passed in 2003. Now, don't worry, we're still going to be talking a lot about Dorothy because she comes a lot in this. But she did develop like a relationship with Jeannie. She would see Jeannie like a couple times out of the week in the hospital and other places and stuff. But yeah,
That's
so.
kind of
Oh,
ridiculous though. Oh, she can't um she can't leave, but she leaves?
yeah,
Like
I
what
know, like,
was
that's yeah, I know, like, that's the thing too, because it's like, I understand that Dorothy was also being abused by Clark, but it's also like, there had like, it's just like like, when it comes to children and, like, this case, like, I really, like, struggle to have empathy for her because it's like, what she did is so like, she was also abusing her daughter on top of it,
Yeah.
and don't worry, she will come back, and she pisses me off. Jeannie stayed in the hospital from 1970 to 1971. She had a shit ton of researchers, doctors, scientists, therapists, like a bunch of people really look into her case because obviously a lot of people were very curious about this, and some people they cared about her generally, and I think other people were more so into the idea of like, oh, like she can't speak, like this is like an experiment. But she had this one doctor, and his name was James Kent, and he was really sweet. He really took good care of her. Jeannie was doing like all of these like different tests and like all this stuff. He felt like she had too many people come to her all at once. Like she never had human interaction, and now she had all these people, and then they would leave. And he said it was just not stable for her. And so he made sure to always stay with her. He went to all of her appointments. He was like always there for her because he really wanted her to have like that one person that she could really recognize. But he said like this was the worst case of like child abuse he had ever encountered. He said like this was the worst case he would ever experience and had ever experienced. He actually like would take her out on walks because she really needed that because of like, she had all these like her physical, like her walking was really hard. Like she wasn't walking normally, like she was walking like staggering. He also played puppets with her, and I thought that was really cute. He said that she loved puppets and that that was her favorite pastime activity, and I just thought that was really cute hearing that. And he said like it took her a little while to like verbalize her love for the puppets, but then she eventually started to. After a few days though of her being in the hospital, it took like she was actually starting to like learn a lot. She was learning how to dress herself. She was learning how to
Wow.
go to like the bathroom like voluntarily. Like she was actually doing really well. But when they did a lot of exams on her, she was 13 years old, but mentally she was 13 months old. And I
Yeah.
think that's like really like sad. James was pretty much like, I don't know if she's ever going to really recover from this. Like they wanted to try and do all these tests and just like be there for her to see if they can get her into maybe like a normal child, like not 13 months. Like I don't they just didn't know where she would ever end up. And James said like cuz she was like her physical appearance too, like she was very small, fragile. Like she did actually end up like gaining weight and actually getting fairly tall, or like getting taller than like 4'6", but they said the physical attributes of like the abuse was a lot. Like she had a lot of like lot of bruising, like black bruising on her wrist and her legs, and
Wow.
even her butt was like very black and like callous from her sitting for so long. And they said that her ribs were undersized and that her bones were of an 11-year-old, and that she struggled to really view anything that was within 10 feet, which was like the like room that she was in. So she really struggled to like really look at anything else. She did struggle. Her motor skills were fairly they were pretty bad too. Like I said, she couldn't walk straight. She had a very bad endurance. She was very steady, or not steady, sorry. And she was like hesitant, I guess, to walk. But they said she was really good at grabbing things, and I guess it's because she had her hands like a little bit free. But they said her
Mhm.
hands were like 2-year-old grabbing things, like, you know what I mean. They said that she was still very, very curious of the world, which would make sense. Like, this is her first time experiencing like people and a different environment, and probably actually experiencing like so many new stimuli. And they said that she really preferred objects over people, which would make sense. She actually began to hoard things and she would collect objects. She didn't like toys, and I think it's because she never really got to experience toys. Like she didn't really get them. She would like hoard and collect like plastic colorful objects. And I thought that was very interesting.
So
And
sad.
yeah, it's really sad. Like they said they think it's just because she like that's what she was used to.
Yeah.
Um
Like those are her Barbie dolls.
they said like if kids were around and wanted to play with her, she wouldn't really interact, which would make kids not interact with her because like kids don't understand, and so they probably think she's just this strange kid who's not like kicking the ball to them. But she would just like look at the ball and just not react, and not in a way of like, oh, she's nervous to play with kids. Like she just generally didn't know what it was. They did say she did like a few things. Like she loved piano, she loved classical music, and whenever they would play it, she would just get really happy, and that She'd always, like, if they put on a song that she didn't know, she'd always try and get it to a song that she really loved. They said her behavior was pretty much like someone with, like, antisocial personality disorder, which would make a lot of sense. They also said, like, when her mom would visit her, she would ask to sit on her mom's lap, but she would get very tense around her mom. She was, like, very interesting, though, with people because they said that she would, like, follow people and, like, kind of, like, cling on to people. It wouldn't matter who they were. Like, she would get pretty, like, oh, that's my mom. Like, she didn't have any of that. But she did eventually start to like people, and she actually, if she saw people that came into the hospital that she recognized, she would actually, like, do everything. And I thought this was so sad. She would do everything in her power to keep them to stay, and if they were to leave, she would actually get pretty sad. And I thought that was really sad because, like, she probably was so used to, like, her dad coming in and, like, leaving, and he didn't have, like, that human interaction, so finally having that would be really hard.
That's so
But
sad.
like I said earlier, like, she struggled to eat and they had to teach her how to eat, which took her a really long time. During her time in the hospital, she was eating a lot more, like, soft food. Her speaking was, like, the big issue. She couldn't speak at all, and when she would speak or verbalize, I guess, she was either using, like, objects, like she would, like, grab chairs to make noise to get people's attention, or she would make, like, hand gestures or facial reactions to try and get people to understand what she's saying. They did say, like, later on she started to, like, a couple months later, she started to mimic people, like, if they would say something. But they said that she was silent and she was pretty quiet around January 1971. So a couple months later, she actually was able to learn around 15 to 20 words, which were individual, like, objects. And they said that she had two sentences that she used, which was not now and stop it. But they don't know if she had learned that while at the hospital or if that was something that she had learned when she was back home, which could kind of make sense that, like, maybe her dad would say a few things to her and she would probably be able to remember those.
So sad.
But
Those were
yeah,
her first words.
she could pay attention to when people were talking. She was able to, like, understand different types of sounds. Like, she could understand the difference between someone talking and then, like, a sound of, like, some, like, the TV or something. It took her, like, a long time. They said the only people that she would talk to, though, was, like, James Kent and a few of the staff that she had gotten closer to. After a month of her being there was this man named Jay Shirley, and he was a professor at a university in Oklahoma, and he actually studied, like, social isolation. And he had been in this industry, like, studying this stuff for 20 years. And he said this was the worst case that he had ever seen. And he took a lot of interest in her case. And so he would go for the past year, he would go on these, like, 3-day visits to interact with Jeannie to see what's going on. And he actually did a sleep study where he was wanting to see if she was, like, mentally disabled, or was she just delayed? Was she autistic? Was there a brain injury or brain damage? When he did this test on her, he noticed that she had a real lack of her REM stage, which is rapid eye movement, which is, like, I think
Mhm.
it's your deepest stage of sleep, if I'm
Yeah.
correct. But she had a real high number of sleep spindles, which is bursts of receptive neural activity. And from those, like, from that stuff, he basically was like, I think she's mentally disabled because that's what a lot of mentally disabled individuals will have. But there was a lot of researchers, and there was this one woman named Susan Curtis, which she'll come a lot in this. She was a linguistic graduate from a university, and she was actually studying Genie as well. And she was like, it doesn't make sense that Genie would be mentally disabled because she's learning how to do things and she's improving a lot. And someone who would be mentally disabled wouldn't improve the way Genie is because that just wouldn't make any sense. And so they came to this conclusion that she probably was born with an average, like, intelligence, but because of the abuse and neglect and isolation and everything, that she became delayed in her development.
Yeah, because IQ is something that you're kind of born with. It's not something that you can really change too much unless there's something super traumatic
Yeah,
or
exactly.
beneficial, whatever.
Yeah, exactly. They did a lot of these tests on her, and James Kent and a few other staff, they actually saw Genie as this really good case, though, to study on human development and stuff, and children development, abuse and isolation. And so they received a grant from the National Institute of Mental Health in America to do a lot of studies, and they had done this study on her to kind of find out what her real age was. And she started off at 1 to 3 years old for her mental age, and then she started to score around 2 to 3. And then in some components of these tests, she actually would score as a normal 12 to 13-year-old girl. So it's very interesting how she would score in different aspects. When they, in May of like 1971, they came to like the main age that she was at this point was 4 years old. I don't really know how all those tests work fully, but I know like they have to do, like, it's not just like your mental age is, it's like there's so many components that you have to add in and different things. And so they came to the conclusion that she was around 4 years old, which is a huge improvement from 13 months.
Really, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, like, at this point, she was able to, like, do these, like, mental categories of, like, objects and situations. And, like, she was starting to just behave more like a child, I guess, as normal as she could, really. I mean, she was never going to be like a normal child. But there was, like, a tiny little earthquake that had happened during this time. And she actually ran to one of the staff members that worked in the kitchen, and the staff said this was actually like a huge improvement for her because this was her very first time running to someone for comfort. And I just think that is so sad. But also, like, they were like, that's just like huge. Like, she was showing she could see these people as her comfort for safety. And then they said, like, years later, she started to get closer with people. She would give hugs, receive hugs, all of that. She did a lot of physical play, mainly with adults. Again, she never really connected with kids, which would make sense. And she started to have a lot more tantrums, and she would actually, like, this is really sad, but she would self harm. She would, like, hit herself, and they had to, like, learn to try and stop that. But it's, like, really hard to do when someone is like, they don't know, right? They don't understand. But Jeannie at this point was considered to be the first language deprived child to undergo any extreme detailed study on her brain. And I thought that was like very interesting. And so around this time, David Rigler and a bunch of like scientists had sought out a 3-year grant from the National Institute of Mental Health to study Genie, and this is actually where her name came from, like I mentioned earlier. They named her Genie because they felt like she was like a genie that if you were to say her name, it would be like her trauma coming out, or like they were afraid that if they said her name, like she could regress or something like that. So they felt like it was kind of like rubbing like a lamp and a genie coming out, and that's why they named her that. I also think they named her that for like privacy reasons as well. Yeah, so Susan Curtis, who I mentioned earlier, she was the linguistics graduate. She was starting to write this paper, and her and Jeannie, they began to really bond. And I thought that was really sweet. They really liked each other. At this point, Jeannie was no longer considered 4. She was mentally now 8 years old. And that's like a huge improvement.
Wow.
This is not even like a year of her being there yet. So I
That's
thought that was really
huge.
good. Now, this is kind of where things started to piss me off when I was researching this. So, there was this woman named Jean Butler. Now, I'm going to either call her Jean Butler or Butler because I feel like if I say Jean and Jeannie, I'm going to end up mixing their names. So, in June of 1971, there was this teacher. Her name was Jean Butler, and she would kind of help these mentally disabled kids like get back into the world, right? And she had asked permission to take Jeannie out on a day trip to her home. And a lot of the staff were kind of unsure, but then they were like, okay, like, sure, why not? Like, this would be good. They obviously trusted this woman. I think she was working there as well. Because obviously they wouldn't just like let some random ass woman like just take her. And so she took Jeannie on a day trip to her home in Country Park, LA. But after the day trip, she claimed that Jeannie had gotten sick and needed to stay with her. And they were like, that's really suspicious. And They just didn't feel like that was right, but they knew that they couldn't bring Genie back into the hospital if she was sick because they'd have to isolate her. And they were like, we can't isolate her because that might, like, all of her improvement might just literally go down the drain and she'll regress. And
Yeah.
so they were pretty much like, okay, you can take her for a bit. And at this point, Jeannie stayed with Jean Butler for like 2 months. I don't know if it was like continuously, but she did stay with her for a while. And Jean, like, she didn't have a husband, she didn't have kids, she lived alone. Of like Jeannie in her home and like foster care, right? And so again, the hospital were like, I don't know, but they, I guess, allowed it. I don't know if the hospital like has control over that. I'm sure it's like a lot more complicated than their opinion.
That's a long time for a kid to be sick.
Well, like, that's the thing. I think what happened was she wasn't sick. She wanted to do foster care, right? And so I think like she just got approval, which is already like there's going to be a lot of like questions that are going to go off your head because there's a lot of like, wait, what the fuck? And so, Jean had noticed a lot of like behaviors from Jeannie being really weird, which no fucking shit. Of course she's going to have behaviors that are weird. Like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. She said that Jeannie did actually start to hit puberty, and they said this was a big improvement of her overall like physical health. At this point, I think Jeannie would have been like a 14-year-old girl, so this would make sense. But I'm not too sure. Like, it was just like very interesting. But Jean though had a boyfriend, and her boyfriend and her were hanging out one night, and they were watching Lassie, and her boyfriend brought Jeannie a toy dog, which scared the shit out of Jeannie, obviously. And at this time, they didn't really know why. They thought it was just because, like, it was new to her, but they didn't know about the stuff about her dad until they found documents, I think, from the police and stories from Jeannie later on and from her mom. Because I think I forgot to mention this actually, but when the police had gone into Clark's house, they actually found a notebook of him like journaling all the abuse he had done to Jeannie, which is like insane that he just like
What
you
the
see
heck?
this a lot with
Yeah.
abusers. They just don't realize what they're doing and they just are okay with it.
That's insane.
Yeah, so Dorothy would come and visit Jeannie when she was staying with Jean Butler, and Dorothy and Jean Butler did get fairly close. They became like pretty good friends. Eventually Jean had her boyfriend move in with her because she thought that the system would be all like, oh, there'll be two parents. This is a better house for her, for Jeannie. And so she tried to reapply for the foster care, but the hospital and a lot of the researchers did not really like Jean because Jean Butler was always arguing with these researchers. She wouldn't let any of the doctors, any of the staff, anyone come and see her except for her mom. And she believed that they were hurting Jeannie. She believed that they were forcing Jeannie into this. And the doctors and all the staff were like, that's not true. Like, we always let Jeannie have a choice in this. And they actually said, like, they really like Jeannie enjoyed doing a lot of these things because like she found them fun. Susan Curtis said that Jean Butler was like really fucking weird because she had told Susan or one of the staff members that she wanted to become famous and that she was going to become famous because of Jeannie. And she also said she wanted to become the next Anne Sullivan, and Anne Sullivan was the teacher and the companion of Helen Keller. And so a lot of the staff were like, that just rubbed them the wrong way. They were like, that's just like, this is a real, like, this is a child. Like, this is not just like a story where you get to become famous through. Like, so yeah, she obviously tried to apply for the foster care, but she never did get it. And I think that pissed her off. And so during like August of 1971, one of the like doctors or researchers was talking to David Rigler, and they were like, "Hey, maybe you should take custody of Jeannie for a bit while we're doing all this," because obviously their goal wasn't to keep Jeannie in the hospital. And so, David Rigler, he had his wife and he had 3 kids, and his
Mhm.
wife, I think she was a social worker. And so they were like, "Sure, we'll do this." Now, they had a dog, which scared Jeannie, obviously. When she first saw the dog, she ran and hid, and it took her like 2 weeks to get comfortable with the dog. And
Mhm.
they said that she actually started to overcome like I don't think her fear of dogs, but I think she was comfortable with certain dogs, like if she knew the dog. but she never really overcame her fear of cats, and I think that's sad, but that makes a little bit more sense because like the scratching and stuff, because obviously cats are fucking assholes sometimes. But
Yeah.
yeah, so she was supposed to only stay with the Rigglers for 3 months, but she stayed for 4 years, and they were really good to her. David became her therapist, and Marilyn became her like teacher. And they actually eventually got Jeannie into a nursery school, and then she ended up going to school for kids that with disabilities, and that's really good. She eventually got to be able to go to school. They obviously, researchers were allowed to, visit her and do their research and just like, get to hang out with her still. And they did notice like a lot of issues with Jeannie, like still. One of them was when Jeannie would legitimately spill liquid or food, she would go into like these hysterical fits, and she would start like hurting herself, and she would start like go freaking out. And they were like, this is really sad because this is obviously how she was being triggered because of what her father did to her. Because I'm sure if she ever like when she spat her food out or spilled it, he beat her, right? So they said they had to like really help her learn to stop that. And the other thing that Jeannie would do is she would also like touch herself a lot in public. And from this is where they thought like maybe she was sexually abused by Clark, but there was really no evidence. So I don't know, but I mean, I wouldn't put it past him to do that. So they had to like really help her with that. But they also were really helping her with her speech. She was learning how to speak a lot better. She was able to speak in like sentences. She wasn't very good at grammar, which I mean, neither am
Yeah.
I. But um she would get like a lot of pronouns mixed up. So if she meant to say like mama loves me, she would say mama loves you and point to herself, because like she would just get it mixed up. But overall, like she was really improving, but she still was like hitting herself. She would self-harm. They had to really like teach her. But one of the good things I thought was Marilyn actually would teach her like, you know what, it's okay, like you can have like you shouldn't hold the pain you have inside, and you can have these like outward feelings. So she told her like it's good to like, cry and like have these outbursts sometimes. And they were really teaching her how to like really like go through the trauma. But because like Jeannie would like hit herself a lot, and I think she would try and scratch herself. Um
Oh,
Marilyn would paint Jeannie's nails, and I thought that was really cute because she said that Jeannie really loved compliments, and so Marilyn would always tell her like, "You look so pretty with your nails colored or painted," and so when like Jeannie would scratch, Marilyn would be like, "Oh, you don't want to wreck your nails; they won't look as good," which I think is a little bit of manipulation, but I mean, I think it worked. Um,
that's the best manipulation. Like,
yeah,
it's positive.
yeah, it's like a positive like manipulation. But yeah, so there was a lot of that, but she was doing really well. But then she started to have a lot of flashbacks, and they said that some of the flashbacks were really sad, but obviously these flashbacks help them understand. And I actually have like a statement of what she said. And before I kind of get into that, just want to say like at this point Jeannie had no understanding of death, and so she thought her father was going to come after her and hurt her and take her back home. And they would have to kind of like teach her, like, your father is dead. And so she would kind of go into these like panics. And one of the statements, like, this is a direct quote from her. And she had said, "Father hit arm, big wood, Jeannie cry, not spit, father hit face, father hits big stick, father hits Jeannie, big stick, father takes piece wood, cry, father make me cry, father is dead." They did say this helped them with their research to understand everything that happened. But I think it's so sad because, like, I was like, when I was researching this, I was like, oh, I wondered if she would ever been able to remember all this. And I know, like, your body can remember, but not you, like, you can repress it. But I guess, like, she started maybe during her healing, she started to actually remember as well. But I just thought that was a really sad quote. And so by 1975, Jeannie was doing really well. They said she was happy, she was improving, she was like, she'd frolic in like the gardens. And I thought that was so cute hearing that, like, that she was just like, she was kind of like loving life. And she's kind of experiencing this. I still see her mom, and apparently, like, Dorothy said that she felt like the Rigglers never liked her. A lot of, like, researchers, and one of them, Jay Shirley, said that Genie's mom, like Dorothy, was never treated as an equal, and that a lot of researchers and staff had held a lot of resentment towards Dorothy, which honestly, me too, because this could have all not happened if Dorothy would have just left. Now, I understand when it comes to abuse, it's not just like, just leave, but
Mhm.
it's still like I think that a lot of the researchers just did not really care for Dorothy. And Susan Curtis had said that Dorothy would give a lot of conflicting information. Like, one minute she would say that Jeannie was able to speak and that she had always spoke before, and then all of a sudden she's saying, oh, she never learned how to speak. And they said that she would say things like that she thought that the, like, researchers wanted to hear, and then she would say things that she would want to, like, protect herself, like, so that she didn't look guilty. During this time, though, Jean, Jean Butler, starts to yap in Dorothy's ear about how the researchers and all of these doctors are terrible people and they're hurting Jeannie, and we got to get her out of these homes. And so later in 1975, at this point, Jeannie is 18, and Dorothy was like, you know what? I think I want my daughter back. And obviously, I think that was kind of the goal, is to get her back home, which I still think was really fucking stupid. And so the Rigglers, though, they were like, okay, we'll end our, like, foster care parenting, but we'll stay in touch, and if you need any help, we'll always be here for you. Now, Dorothy at this point is, like, pretty blind and brings Jeannie into her home, and then what do you know? She's like, oh, Jeannie is too hard, like, this is too much for me. And she just calls up the healthcare system in California, and she's just like, hey, I can't take care of her, find her a home. And she just rehomes her.
What?
And the Rigglers were pissed. Everyone was upset with Dorothy. They were like, why would you just put her into a random home? The Rigglers were like, we could have taken her, we could have helped you. What is wrong? Like, why would you do that? And this is kind of the moment where, like, I really do not like Dorothy. Because of this moment, she had put Jeannie into a new foster care home that was abusive. And
Oh, oh
because of
no.
that, they were physically and emotionally abusive. And if Jeannie threw up, they would threaten her that she would never see her mom. And it got to the point where Jeannie was, like, really scared to open her mouth. She was afraid to eat because she didn't want to vomit in the fear that she might be beat. And because of this, she started to regress and she stopped speaking again. She would just be quiet. And during this time, though, Susan Curtis was still in contact, and obviously she noticed this, so she contacted, like, everyone, was like, we got to get Jeannie out. And so by 1977, Jeannie was taken out of this home. So I don't know if she was in that home for like a year. He didn't really say if she was in it for 2 years, but she got out. David Rigler helped her out, and so did John Miner, who was also the attorney for Dorothy. And so Jeannie stayed at the hospital again for 2 weeks, and she improved, which is really good. And then she went into a better foster care home, but that foster care home didn't last really long. It didn't say why, it just said, like, it just didn't last long. She ended up being constantly moving from foster care to foster care. And a lot of these homes were bad for her, and it was fucking Jeannie up. Jeannie didn't understand why, and Susan Curtis noticed this because she was still doing, like, a lot of research and a lot of study still with her. And at this time, like, she was noticing that Jeannie was, like, blaming herself for all of this. She thought it was her fault. She thought she was bad. And so Susan had contacted the hospital, and she kind of was just telling everyone, like, we can't keep moving her. Like, she needs to find a home permanently. So Susan Curtis decided that she was going to become, or she wanted to become, like, her legal guardian. And that was honestly the best choice. And she had become, like, fairly close with Dorothy. But during all this, she'd been writing this paper, and it was titled Genie Psycholinguistic Study of Modern Day Wild Child. And she had been writing that, and in 1976 it was published, and when it got published, Dorothy saw it, and Dorothy was fucking pissed. She was like, I thought you were actually my friend, but you're just trying to make me look like a bad mom, which, to be honest, she was as well. And so he got pissed off at Susan, and she cut Susan off. She said, you cannot talk to my daughter, you're never allowed to talk to my daughter. And so all that happened, and then Dorothy tried to sue the hospital. She tried to sue Susan. She tried to sue all the researchers. And she claimed it went through in like 1984, but in an interview in 1993, like David Rigler had done an interview, and he said that it never went to court. It actually was just like thrown out the window. So Genie again was placed in a lot of like abusive foster care homes, and one of the researchers, Jay Shirley, said he actually saw Jeannie on her 27th birthday, and she was very depressed. She was not really talking. She was still verbal, but she wasn't really talking. And then the other thing is that I thought was really sad is like when you look at Jeannie on like Google Images, she was like a really pretty girl. And when she got put in all these homes, they just like cut her hair off like very ugly. And I don't mean that from like a personal opinion. I mean like they just didn't care. Like whoever was cutting her hair was just doing it because they just needed to cut her hair like it was a problem. And it just makes me sad like when you see like someone where it's like they just didn't care. Like she was just being thrown into these homes like she's just nothing. Who cares? Like just put her here. And it just makes me so sad that like the system fucking failed her. Her parents failed her. Everyone was failing her. In like 1994, she did get put into a really supportive foster care home. And Dorothy claimed that she would visit her and that she was, she was doing a lot better and she was still happy and she was still verbal. And then David, he said that he still saw Jeannie and he would still stay in contact with Jeannie. And that Jeannie still recognized him and she would still call him by his name and all that. And apparently Susan, she never was able to get back in contact with her. Apparently in like as of like 2016, Jeannie has been living a really small life in LA and she's in a private facility for the mentally disabled, or it's mentally undeveloped adults. People claim they've seen her and that she seems happier, and she speaks a few words, but she still communicates well. Unsure if she's still alive. If Jeannie is still alive, she'd be around 67. And I just think her story is really, really sad. Her mom ended up dying in like 2003 from like natural causes. And her brother, apparently, he moved to Ohio sometime, and he said that he would never watch or look at anything that was to do with Jeannie because he didn't want to know. And I thought that was really sad. But yeah, there's been plenty of like shows done on her. There was a documentary titled Secret of the Wild Child, which won an Emmy in 2002. And there's
Wow.
also a TV series called Body Shock. And there was an episode titled Feral Children that Jeannie, there was a segment on Jeannie. And then there's been movies done on her called, one was called Mockingbird Don't Sing. But I just feel really, really sad for this poor woman. Like she's obviously living like a private life, like no one, like her privacy is very kept concealed, and I just think that so many people failed her, and a lot of people like do wonder like was the research ethical, was she doing really well, and like I feel like if she would have stayed with Susan Curtis or the Rigglers, she probably would have lived a probably a better, well obviously she would have lived a better life, but yeah,
Yeah. Wow.
the foster care system sucks, and it just sucks that she couldn't have been like adopted by someone that like the Rigglers or what. But I guess there's obviously, I don't know, maybe there's some reason, I don't know, but
Yeah, like she could have been adopted by people who are licensed professionals and who knew how to take care of her, but instead they just put her into homes that,
it's sad knowing like one man's actions literally just fucked up her life forever. And I just think that's what's so sad about a lot of these like abuse cases, especially with children.
mhm.
So
And then
yeah.
especially for the other son too, like Jonathan, where he was just like he probably blames himself even to like this day where he's like, God.
Yeah, and he was like a really sweet man. There was an interview on he had done in like, I don't remember. I think it was 2007. and I think he said he struggled with it, and that's why I think he didn't watch any of the stuff about her because, he also went through a lot of abuse too. Like,
Hmm.
even though he didn't have like the same extent, he was still like being beat by his dad, and he apparently died in 2011. I can't remember if I said that. But
Oh,
yeah, I feel bad for the brother as well. Because that
yeah,
would have been a lot, and like him being forced to also partake in the abuse too with
yeah.
uh Jeannie, and so yeah, I think it's really sad. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I want to apologize for a little bit of the audio, but just know the audios in the future episodes are pretty great. But if anything we said in this episode or future episodes is wrong, or maybe you want to elaborate on it, or you just want to have a conversation, feel free to comment below. And with that, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in another episode.